Coming. Nice to see you all, sort of virtually. But I hope I'll try and make this as interactive as possible. Let me get the presentation up. And then just to double check, everyone can see the slides, correct? Awesome. So yeah, for today's workshop, I wanted to just talk a little bit about how our group uses different data science tools to increase the capacity of the work that we do with studying marine ecosystems. And just start a little bit with how we're kind of within the Mega Lab group trying to change a little bit of how we do science just to reach broader audiences and make sure that the value of our work really translates and reaches as many people as possible. So I started the Mega Lab with two close friends. We all actually, well, two of us went to graduate school at Manoa, Haunani Kane and myself. I should have introduced myself a little bit more formally. My name's John Burns. I'm a professor at UH Hilo in marine science and data science. And so Haunani and I went to graduate school, and along with our other friend, Cliff Capono. And Cliff did his master's at Manoa, but then went on to UCSD. And so Haunani's a geologist, I'm a biologist, and Cliff is a chemist. But we all really connected mostly just being friends with strong passions for the ocean. So Cliff is also a professional surfer. Haunani is just exceptionally talented. She's one of the navigators for the Hokulea, also incredible water woman. And then I'm always trying to kind of play catch up to them. But I really was drawn to the ocean, um, mostly just for surfing and fishing and diving and stuff, before the science interest was there. And, we sort of felt as we went through the process of becoming scientists that there was a bit of an expectation of kind of having, I will say, like, single dimensional traits, as in, there's ways a scientist should act, there's ways a scientist should be. And one thing that we found is we sort of had to sometimes sort of hide those outside interests, right? Because they were often viewed as like distractions from science. It's like, no, you got to just focus on your work. You can't be out there fishing, you can't be out there surfing. But it was really counterintuitive to me because, to be honest, like just here on Hawaii Island, I feel like one of the most fortunate experiences I've had is getting to go fish with a lot of older uncles from the southeast side of this island. And I eventually went and like built a boat with one of them. And what I've learned about marine resources and fish populations and how these systems have changed through time, so much of it came from them and their knowledge. And it really cemented to me that, not all knowledge comes in one form, and it certainly doesn't just come from one set of institutions. And so we wanted to create, we always said, hey, look, if we ever become professors at some point, let's make a lab that's more of a team environment and less of like, a single individual's sort of achievements, if you will. So the Mega Lab kind of came about of just wanting to be a fun place. And the name itself is really, a play on the use of acronyms in science. So it does stand for the Multi-Scale Environmental Graphical Analysis Lab. But we just thought it was funny to have a mouthful of a name be an acronym that's a fun word to say. But ultimately, like, we want to train and work with individuals who see the world creatively and use that to make pathways for new scientific discovery. And so what I mean by that is that we try to be really open with students about the process that we went through, both the highs and the lows, and just set them up for understanding the reality of that experience as opposed to just giving expectations. And we also really tried to get them to bring their own individualistic attributes to the table and let that be a part of their science. And I'll give two examples in a minute, but to speak more generally, like, we have a lot of students from Hawaii, and a lot of them have really strong personal connections to the places that they work. And so we try to encourage them to bring that into how they design their projects and how they interpret it. Because if you do that, we often find the science can be a lot more meaningful and the general interest in the results that we produce is greater, and it can go a lot further in terms of making positive change and also getting people involved. And one way that we try to make this work is really sharing our stories. We feel that like storytelling is something that hasn't really been applied enough in science because so much of what we do is really hidden away, right? Like our data is locked up in repositories. For instance, I used to go on a lot of cruises with NOAA, like on the ship-based expeditions. And it was really funny trying to describe that to my friends that have nothing to do with science, because first they hear cruise and they think we're on like a cruise ship. And they're like, why do you guys take cruise ships to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, And just like everything that goes on in our day to day is very hard to translate. Just the madness from labeling like a million different tubes that you're putting samples into, or how like, you'll scream at your computer and want to throw it out the window when you're running into coding issues. Like this is our world, and it's very funky and strange, but we can use storytelling to humanize that and ultimately like redefine what a scientist looks and acts like, right? Get people to realize like we all share this process no matter what domain we're in. Often I find artists are so similar to scientists in a lot of the way they approach problem solving and creating things. And so that gives us kind of a vessel to just showcase what we do and then also put a spotlight on how we develop technologies. And, our large goal is to not just develop technologies, but give it to communities who need it. Because a lot of the technology, like the 3D mapping I'm going to talk about today, it directly informs responses to climate change. We work with a lot of agencies where it's changed how they manage marine resources. And at the end of the day, our goal is quite simple. We want to promote positive human environmental interaction. And we don't want to push a false notion that like all technology is bad, right? Like we all have cell phones in our pockets. We're all stuck with computers and internet because it's a part of the modern world. But we can certainly find ways that those technologies can also be vessels that improve our relationship with nature. And so we tried to find mechanisms for that and, really attract audiences from the level of children all the way up to, adults and other scientists as well. Just to give some examples, like this is Kylie Pascoe. She's a PhD student in the lab. This is her doing some 3D mapping on a project we did in Fiji. And Kylie is one that, she set out and never really saw herself as becoming a PhD scientist, but she grew up in Kaneohe, multi-generational family of fishermen. And I was always just shocked at how innately she already knew patterns that were happening in the ocean. So at an undergraduate level, when she worked with us, we'd be out there and she's just like, oh yeah, that limu. I mean, you always see it in October. Didn't you guys know that? And we're like, no, I don't know if anyone really knows that very well. And so as she came more empowered and recognizing like how much knowledge she really has, she's thrived as a scientist and actually just recently got a Nancy Foster fellowship too, which is a very competitive marine science fellowship. And so she's doing really incredible work now, and just came back from a long expedition in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands and has become like a phenomenal role model for a lot of kids on this island, especially because she's actively involved in outreach. Another student I just wanted to highlight is Maluhia Kinimaka. She's from Kauai. And Malu is just one of those insanely talented people. She went to Stanford for her engineering degree, and she's also a professional surfer, like sponsored by Roxy. And she wanted to go into a marine science PhD because she really wants to do work that helps protect coastal resiliency on Kauai. And she came up against a similar barrier that we appreciated, where the first few folks she talked to told her like, well, you got to pick like pro surfing or science, like which one? And she really didn't want to give that up. And when we talked to her, we said like, well, don't, because the audience you can reach through that, surfing community is huge. And you could be inspiring kids that, are watching you for the surfing aspect that now might see the value of science and go down a whole nother route. And so this is just a photo of her using like ROVs because she's really, a big engineering nerd, and she's helped us optimize these systems for mapping deep reefs. And now she is doing her PhD and focusing on understanding how reef changes on Kauai is like altering sand deposition and how sea level rise is going to affect these coastal communities that have lived in these watersheds, for so long, that may be displaced in the near future. So that's a little bit of background kind of on who we are and what we're trying to do. But at the core of a lot of what we do, it's three-dimensional mapping. And that's something that I developed during my PhD at Manoa when I was working under Ruth Gates. And at the time, I was a little bit dismayed about how marine science, like the methods were really living in the past, in my opinion. Not everything, but when it came to ecology, like we still relied on just taking single photographs of spots on the reef. And to me, that was just wild considering like we're sending rovers to Mars where we've got like all this crazy technology and we're just taking discrete photos. And I was studying coral diseases at the time, and it really frustrated me because I couldn't show what the impact of a disease outbreak like bleaching was doing to the reef, right? But I knew that at the core of it, when we lost living corals, like the structure of that system was deteriorating, similar to a rainforest losing trees, right? If you lose that canopy and you lose the structure, the biodiversity tends to collapse afterwards. And so I started looking to other fields and I tried using photogrammetry as a tool where you can take a normal single lens camera, but get overlapping images and produce these high resolution 3D models. And I will never forget that time because when I talked to nearly anyone about it, they would just tell me like, well, that's a foolish thing. One, it's too difficult. You're gonna, probably not succeed. It takes too much computing power. And like, we already do it this way. We've done it this way. It's not going to change. But Ruth was, a real visionary, and she pulled me aside and was like, don't listen to anyone, take the risk and go for this because if it works, this could change how we do things in the field. And, thank God I listened to her because sure enough, it worked really well. And now this is becoming like the industry standard for benthic surveying because, the amount of data you can extract is so much greater than just single images. And we're able to like specifically see how a reef changes through time. And in addition to that, we're getting to the point now where we can pinpoint the exact structural elements from each type of coral, right? Like a branching coral versus a mounding coral versus a boulder or sand, and dissect how that is influencing every different type of fish as well as invertebrates. And so we're like figuring out the pieces of the puzzle that makes the ecosystems function. And how that translates for managers is just as an example, we have projects with like the Park Service, and we can help them prioritize, certain areas and certain species that play a more key role in facilitating biodiversity than others. And so that's what I wanted to really focus on in this workshop, since it's like a data science program, right? Like, how can we use photogrammetry? And so I just want to give some key overview. Some of it might be boring to some of you. I apologize in advance. But if anyone is interested in this, I wanted to give at least enough detail so you kind of understand how it works and what tools are required and what the process is like. And then sort of focus on like key things that I've learned. So if any of you, do set out to try this, you've got a better base of knowledge. And the last thing I'll say is like, for this to be super useful, like don't be shy to just interrupt me and ask any question at any point, especially if you've tried using these tools, because my role in the last few years has really become almost like a consultant where we're working with NOAA, DAR, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, all these groups because they want to use it, and everyone comes with the same questions like, oh, what camera do we need? Why doesn't this work? How do we get this data? So this is like a mini example of a lot of like workshop style programs we run for various agencies. So, I'm an open book. I believe in open source science. So you can ask me any question from the most simplistic things to maybe you're doing 3D modeling and you're stuck on some issue, and I'm happy to talk about it. I thought it would be more fun if we actually do it right away and everyone can get a sense of it. Are we cool with that? Do people want to try? All right, awesome. I see a thumbs up. I can only see a few of you, but is it Kylie? Kate, Kylie? Yeah, right on. Okay, so Kylie is into it. I'm gonna put you on the spot because you're into it. We're gonna do it. And so we're actually trying to launch like a citizen science campaign called Map to Adapt next year, and we're trying to build like a global database so anyone that's involved in like preserving and protecting natural ecosystems can use the simplest platform, which is your phone, and just record videos of any environment and then create 3D models that we're going to host so people can just share it and see it on a global scale. And then behind that, we're building a very sophisticated network using graph theory so we can leverage like all the expensive research that has been done. And it'll help us build these networks where, say, Kylie, can I pick on you again and just ask what the background of that picture is?
Yeah, no problem. Kaneohe Bay near Chinaman's Hat.
Yes, what a phenomenal spot. So that's a great one, right? Like Kaneohe Bay, very well studied area. But maybe there's a reef there by Chinaman's Hat that you go to and you're like, oh, I wonder how this compares to other places in Hawaii and the globe. So you could just like easily make a little 3D model, and then the network translates patterns in the color as well as the structure to tell you which other reefs that have been studied by scientists it's most similar to. And so you could find out like, oh, I'm very similar to these other sites in K Bay, or you might find like, wow, this is a super unique area. It's more similar to these reefs, in this other island of Hawaii or maybe another location in the Pacific. And it just helps people answer things of like, how healthy is my reef? What's it like? How does it compare to other places? So ultimately, we're trying to empower people. And using phones was like the easiest way where no one needs to buy a fancy camera. We almost all have them, and it's pretty straightforward. So the picture on the right sort of shows you like the flight path, if you will. So you can find anything around you. Could be a coffee mug, could be a chair, anything with some three-dimensionality, right? So I got this coffee cup earlier, right? If I were going to model this, the background is playing games with me. There we go. Like I would take the phone. I gotta just kill this background. Hang on. Sorry, folks. Let's see if I can do this. All right. Well, that's gonna be a little bit tricky. Let's see if I can do this. Here we go. Okay. Did the share? Can everyone see the screen still? The power. Okay, perfect. All right. So if you have your phone, you kind of want to like move around, like take the video around the scene and then over the top of it. And a spiraling pattern works pretty good, but just in a nutshell, you're trying to like capture that object from all angles. And then all you have to do is go to this website, lumalabs.ai dashboard captures, and drop the video into that website. So if you can like, send it to your computer with, file drop or something, it'll let you just put it right in there. So I'm going to pull this up so you can kind of see what it looks like. It might require you to sign in with Google, but once you have that video, just drop it in. This is all you have to do. It's like record the video, drop it into this create. Like you'll get a little dashboard like this. You just say create, drop the video in there, and it'll start rendering on its own. It's as easy as it gets. And the way that this works is is really cool actually. So like Luma is using NERF, which is a new area of 3D modeling where it's a neural radiance field and then generative AI to fill in based on the video, like all the pixels. It'll build the three-dimensional scene using the optics of the camera. So it works really similar to your eyes, right? Like if you're sitting at your desk and you close one eye, it can be pretty hard to grab something because you're losing that depth perception. So the reason why the video is trying to capture all angles is it's really similar to what birds do, right? Like they don't have stereo vision. So that's why they're always twitching their heads when you see them trying to pick off your crumbs. Because as you get more views of any scene, your brain can generate depth perception. And that's the same thing these algorithms are doing, right? It knows properties of your lens, like your brain knows properties of your eyes. And as it sees the same thing from multiple angles, it can estimate the position of your camera and what the three dimensionality of that scene must be. And so it might take anywhere from like a few minutes to maybe 15, 20 minutes to build that model. That's why I wanted to just do it now. I don't know if anyone's trying. Should we just try? Like, please try if you can. Is anyone having an issue getting into the website and logging in?
I'm just curious, are there any limitations to like video length or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the longer the video, the more time it'll take to process. I would say for the workshop, try just do like 30 seconds or less. We've played around with like 5 to 10, 15-minute videos of like really large reef areas. They will work. The only thing that happens is that the longer the video, it's processing on these remote servers. And so there can be crashes and they can time out. So the probability of that happening is just greater the longer your video is. But if it does happen, don't get dismayed. We found if you just try again, eventually it will work. But if you do like 5 minutes or less, it's almost guaranteed that it'll render it without an issue. I would say again for this exercise, just do like 30 seconds because then when we get to the end of the presentation, you should be able to see um, what you made. And like, here's just an example of what this looks like. So here's one. Can everyone see the video of this Parides coral on the screen? Is that, I don't know if that's showing up. But this is one like students made just here in Hilo, again, just with an iPhone in a plastic bag of all things. So it just goes to show like, we're trying to use this approach because it's super accessible and it's kind of like an easy three-step process. Record a video, drop it into Luma AI, and then to get it into the map, all you got to do is once we have the website, you'll just write your name, a description, coordinates, and there you go. You're off to the races. So yeah, just go ahead, try record like I said, it could be coffee cup, chair, mug, yourself. Um, it's pretty fun to do. I did one um of like my kids. I'll show you that one. And if you're like busy doing it and I'm just talking, like please ignore me. Don't worry about that at all. But yeah, my daughter, she's actually turning 8 on Sunday. She wanted to test pilot this one day. And so, you just have to have them stay as still as possible on the floor. And yeah, she really, really like enjoyed this. And then it makes these little like automatic videos for you, but you can also like just take the mouse and drag and explore them. And you can kind of see like at this angle, she did a great job of holding still. And then when I'm over here, you can almost see the smile pop up. She started moving her face a little bit, so it gets kind of blurry and um, strange. But yeah, it's like really easy tool. Oh yeah, so Kylie, cool. You already know about the app. Yeah, the app works really good too. That's a great point. Luma AI has an app, so you can just download that to your phone and even do it easier. It's like more direct. So yeah, then there's another question. If it's queued, that's exactly what you want. Can we export them? Yes, you can export them. There's several file formats. The one that is really universal is the .obj. And then the OBJ you can load into like Blender or other software platforms too. So you can like edit it and refine it and clean it up as well. And then I just have this up here. Hopefully I'm not distracting you too much, but this is just kind of an example of some of the workflows we're working through. Since this is recorded, if you want to come back to this later, or you can email me anytime and I can share this stuff with you, but it's pretty straightforward. You just find some area that you're trying to, create a 3D model of. It also doesn't have to be your phone, right? You can use GoPros to any video platform if you're taking it underwater. We found that for small objects, like the circular spiral pattern works really good. And as I was just talking about, you just got to go to the Luma website, you click, drag, and drop your model in there, wait for it to finish. And then once we have the Map to Adapt platform up, you'll just be filling in a little bit of metadata. And yeah, we're hoping people get pretty excited. We've had such huge success with this with like K through 12 school groups. Kids really like making 3D models of stuff. And so that sort of inspired us to try make this like a global mapping kind of game activity, if you will. And we're also hoping to gamify it a little bit and have like leaderboards for different locations. So, like just in Hawaii, each island, we can have like who's got the most 3D models, because we thought if we could get a global community going where we can produce 1 million of these within, 5 years, like it'd just be such a cool resource, because then it's a way for citizen scientists to communicate right back to researchers, and you have a visual product to share, right? You could say like, hey, I've been mapping this intertidal zone in California, or a coral reef in Hawaii, or a seagrass meadow, in the Caribbean, whatever it might be. If you're seeing something that's interesting or some change that's occurring, you can just flag that and share it to scientists and have more direct communication to kind of identify and flag environmental issues of concern. Oh, and then yeah, Maria put our website in the chat. Thanks for doing that too. And if you go to the website as well, we have a monthly newsletter. You guys can sign up for that. And then that's where we'll be making announcements about the Map to Adapt initiative. We're working on building a full website for it right now, and we've got some animators making like really fun cartoons of kind of how everything works, just so the instructions can be not dependent on language or anything like that. So anyone anywhere in the world can sort of follow along and be able to do it. We're kind of copying IKEA, if you will. I don't know if you're all familiar, but like the IKEA instructions are legendary in graphic design because there's no text necessary, which is really great for equity and making sure that everyone can play a role. Okay, so hopefully you're there. If not, just feel free to keep working on it and get that queued up for processing. And in the meanwhile, I'm just going to kind of go through now some of the more, I guess, like data science-y specifics of this. And like I said, I just want to give an overview of these techniques. And a lot of it is stuff that if you're going to get into this, right, it's just things that I found are really important to be considering in your approach, because they can make a big difference in the data quality products that you're going to develop. For a little bit of background, like people tend to think of photogrammetry as a new thing, but it's not at all. Photogrammetry is just a mapping technique, and I've really kind of become a massive map nerd since I started doing this. Because I asked some simple questions like, what was the deal with maps? Like, why did we even do this? And it's fascinating, like how profound maps really are for shaping civilizations. Like it's the earliest way we kind of created an orientation of our space, not just in this world, but even early philosophers, right? Like we were mapping ourself in relation to the cosmos. Like what's our place in this world, in this universe? And as we modernized, right, it became a big way for geopolitical systems to interact. It became boundaries. It became economic trade routes. One fascinating thing we found is actually like Maui, specifically Lahaina, was really the earliest place of Hawaiian cartographers, and they would make maps. And it's so cool looking them up in the archives, because everyone who created maps, like they're the center of the world. And so depending on where you look at the origin, you see the world totally differently. And so I realized like mapping is just a tool to like understand your place in this broader picture. And there's also so much, though, in the eye of the beholder about how you want to create it and what information you want to take from it. And so as we sort of evolved from mapping with hand drawings, photography came around. And people started mapping, coastal areas and large regions using pictures. And originally they were optical mechanical systems. So like I wish, I don't know, like old tech fascinates me. Like I wish we still had machines like the one on the right where I could be in the lab like spinning wheels and adjusting dials like a mad scientist. But then that was the level of technicality it took just to align photographs, right? And a really early way this was used was looking at like coastal erosion in California. Like people recognized it changed and they wanted to map that to see how it was happening. So it was a very cumbersome process. And then everything changed in the late 90s, early 2000s from this algorithm called scale invariant feature transform. And it's commonly known as SIFT. And what it did was use sort of a matrix algebra approach to something that many of you may have done, especially if you're as old as me and you remember doing film photography. But like I was really into photography. And so like, I had a film camera. We had like dark rooms. And, if you wanted to do like a cool landscape series, right, you would take a bunch of pictures of like a valley, for instance, and then you just line them up, right? You find the things that match photo to photo and you could tape them together and you make this like big panoramic. Now your iPhone does that, right? You can go to pano setting and it lets you like scan across. But what it's basically doing is what's kind of shown in this series of images, where it's two pictures of these kids on the beach, and scale invariant feature transform will throw thousands of points on both images, and anything that doesn't change, right? Hence invariant, it can match image to image. And so all of a sudden, the ability to align photos based on shared features became increasingly efficient from a computing standpoint. So photogrammetry is this process of making 3D models like I described, from overlapping images. And the way it is based is one, aligning all those images together. And so this process used to take such an enormous amount of time, but once the SIFT algorithms came around, it automated everything. So now, as long as all of your images have ample overlap, they can be matched to one another. And then that's what led the way for three-dimensional scenes to be created from this environment. So, for instance, like this just sort of shows like up until the early 1900s, it was very iterative. You would have to manually do all these adjustments to get the images to align and create a three-dimensional reconstruction. And then when computer vision started taking off, especially in the last, several years with SIFT algorithms, I could go on and on in technical details. What it basically did was got rid of the need for stereo cameras. So now instead of needing two cameras that function like two eyes to produce depth perception, you can use one. And that reduced the cost and technical requirements enormously. And so it opened the floodgates for people to just take a regular digital camera and get a lot of overlapping images, just like you did with your phone for the Luma AI product, and it'll just build this three-dimensional construction without all this crazy manual work where you're scaling it and you have to make it happen on your own. And even in just the last 10 years, I started playing around with this like 2009, 2010, and I had at the time like a high-powered gaming laptop I wrote a grant for, and I would like do a 50 image model and I would have to put it on its side with three fans blowing on it, and it would take like weeks to render. It would usually crash. And now I can collect, hundreds of images with a far higher resolution camera and in just a couple hours do everything in the process. So it's become outrageously efficient and user friendly. But I just like to point out that background because a lot of people think, like it's this very recent technology, which is not the case. It's something that's been changing through time. It's just that recent data science tools have made it so much more efficient and effective that it's able to be used in like, a multitude of fields. So what's important to realize is structure from motion. It really is photogrammetry. It's just that process of deriving structure when your camera is in motion around the scene. And you have to have that motion or there's no way to figure out depth perception. The first thing I always get asked is, what's the best camera? And I always try to tell people, like, don't get locked into that mindset of like, well, these people use this, so I have to use the same system. There is absolutely no one best or most important or most useful camera system. So I'm very platform agnostic, right? Like I learned film on Nikons. I was obsessed with Nikons for a long time. And then when I had some grants, I actually switched to Canon because lens optics are so important. And the Canon prime lenses were so good. And if you know anything about photography, right, like it's all about the lens. And so I realized, like, oh, I can switch camera bodies, but I can stick with these lenses. And then Sony came along and made mirrorless cameras. So the megapixel resolution is like through the roof. The light sensitivity is incredible. And so we switched to that platform. But I don't encourage anyone to use exactly what we use. I always stress like whatever your question is should guide the approach. So I have like different lenses for different projects, different cameras. And a lot of times we just go with what's like the best deal, meaning that they'll discontinue certain models of cameras and you can pick them up for really cheap. And that's great. Or I want something very specific and I'll spend what's necessary to get that. I will say there is this group I'm a part of. It's the ISPRS. It's the International Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. And if you're into this at all, check them out. They're mostly Europeans and archaeologists, but they have really pioneered this approach. And it's sad to me sometimes how few people look at the literature on what they've done because they are like deep into the technical evaluations of different platforms. And it's a very, very collaborative and open community. So I go to a lot of their conferences um, selfishly because they're usually in these beautiful places like Greece and Italy. And one year was in Cyprus. So it's like a killer trip. But also because, marine scientists can be a little bit guarded and protective. There's like a lot of ego of like, oh, I want to be the best group that does this thing, whatever. These folks, Matt, like anything you ask, they're happy to help. And I've learned so much from them. So they're really useful. And then the last thing I just want to say is I mentioned it already, but always let your question guide the approach. So 9 times out of 10, people come to me just wanting specific platforms and camera settings. And it's very hard to deal with because you have to have an adaptive mindset and recognize that there's no one size fits all. It's a matter of what you're trying to do. So in the coral realm, for instance, if you're trying to measure colony growth, that requires like a very specific approach versus if you're doing large area mapping, you're going to want a totally different system and a totally different style of image acquisition. So it's much more about your research question than it is about the tools that you have at your disposal. I always sort of joke about this, but like it's photogrammetry. So like I try to tell people that want to optimize this, like if you want to get good at it, get good at photography. So, instead of getting lost in scientific literature, if you're new to photography, like take a photo class because so much of it is like understanding the way cameras work. And because it's deriving information from the image pixel quality, like literally the sharpness and the light evenness and not having overexposure, like everything that goes into making a good photograph will give you a better three-dimensional model. And the higher resolution the model, the more fine scale measurements you can make. So you really want to be thinking about the photographic principles, less about like, what are the plug and play settings? And I'll get into this later, but a lot of agencies we work with, they kind of obsess over like, automated protocols. So they don't want to be down there underwater changing camera settings. And I'm always trying to push them away from that fear because sometimes you go out and there's less light that day and you want to adjust the settings to accommodate that. You don't want to be afraid of manually adjusting things because those adjustments make a big, impact on the quality of the images. And you want to remember too, like when it comes to purchasing equipment, like I said before, lenses can last decades. I have old lenses that are like 30 years old that I'll never get rid of because they're just such high portrait quality. Whereas the camera bodies, those things get outdated really rapidly. So if you're going to invest in anything, invest in the lens because within a year, there's going to be a new camera body that's twice as good as the last model. That's just the pace of advancement that we're at. But the lenses, a good lens is a good lens. There's just no two ways around that. Another thing to recognize, and apologies to those that already know this, but some don't, is just different cameras have different sensor properties. So I'm a big advocate of like full frame sensors. Cheaper digital cameras have like APS-C. It's basically like a cropped sensor. So you might have, for instance, an 18 millimeter lens, but the field of view is not true to an 18 millimeter lens. It'll be more like what you might get for a 24 millimeter lens. And that's sort of depicted on the bottom left, right? Like if I have the same lens with a crop versus a full frame sensor, the full frame captures more. And you can see on the right the difference between the field of view, right? So the smaller the millimeter number, the larger the area you're capturing in every single image. And distortion really matters too. So like I have my favorite lens right now is like a 14 millimeter rectilinear lens. And why that's helpful is that everything is straight and non-distorted, but I get such a wide field of view that I can be in shallow water and still have so much image, like seen in the image, like so much of the reef, that it's very easy to facilitate that overlap in image alignment, like I was talking about, right? So I can get like an inch away from the subject, but still have enough in the frame that it's able to align photos, right? Whereas if I used a more zoomed in lens, I can get so lost in the zoom, if you will, that like I can't match the images anymore. It becomes hard to do. And so all of that though is to just say like there is no one right option. Everything is just different, and you, as I mentioned before, you want what works for your project. As I was talking about, like there's a lot of photographers that will kind of nerd out on lens properties. And so if you want to really know what works for you, just dig into some of these online forums. People will test distortion properties. So like on the left, you see two calibration grids on the bottom left, sorry. And the one on the left, you should hopefully see that barrel distortion that's happening, where things in the middle of the picture get a little bit distorted as opposed to the outside. And you can have the same thing happen in an inverse way with a fisheye lens, right? What's in the center is spatially accurate, but the edges get very distorted. If you're trying to accurately capture the natural world, you do not want distortion, right? So you want to make sure you have lenses and that you're taking pictures from distances that minimize that distortion. This is particularly useful to think about if you have a zoom lens. So a zoom lens is one that, say, may go from 18 millimeters to 36. So just like your iPhone, right? You can zoom in and you can zoom out. All of those zoom lenses have a specific length that has the least distortion. And so these are the things you want to research before you buy a camera. Like if I know, for instance, hey, I want to survey habitats and I want to do plots that are 10 by 10 meters. The math I have to do is, all right, if it's that large and I want to survey it within an hour, based on my lens, if I have X field of view, I need to be 2 meters above the habitat to capture, say, 4 meters in my field of view. And this is how you like back calculate to figure out how close you have to take all your images together, if that makes sense, right? So it's kind of fascinating how you can really know exactly what you need based on what you're trying to capture before you even have to go through the trouble of experimenting with different camera platforms. It's all math. So if you do the dirty work, you kind of know exactly what you should be doing before you even go out. And so this frustrates a lot of my colleagues because they'll be like, well, you told us you shoot from 1 meter off the substrate. So we do everything from 1 meter off the substrate. But then you did that project and you guys were 3 meters off the substrate. And it's like, well, yeah, but that one I was trying to do a massive shipwreck. So I had to adjust my flight path based on the optical properties to get everything that I needed, right? Whereas if I'm doing a smaller spatial area, I'm going to change everything. And so this is why I say you don't want to get caught in the trap of doing the same thing every time. I almost always have a unique protocol for every single project if there's any different sort of question involved. And so the last thing I'll say is like these MTF modulation transfer functions. This might be kind of like getting way too in the weeds, but these graphs that you're seeing on the right, they exist for every lens that's pretty much made. And so I go and research all of these, again, knowing what I'm trying to do. And that's what guides the equipment that I get is whatever is going to have the best properties for sharpness and clarity. Because when we're 3D mapping, we're not taking portrait photos, right? Like all of you know the portrait setting in your iPhone. It's like very artistic. It'll make your face nice and crisp and the background blurry. You're trying to get the opposite if you're 3D modeling. You want everything crisp and in focus. So you're really adapting to that approach. Knowing that, you can figure out exactly what the best settings are based on your system. And it all comes down to this triangle. You're balancing three things at once. All right. Those three things are blur, and you minimize blur with shutter speed. So shutter speed is like how long you open up the camera to let light in. And so if I'm trying to shoot stars at night, it's dark. I got to open that shutter a really, really, really long time. But when I do that, it's highly susceptible to blur. So now I need a tripod and I have to do other things to control that. Whereas if I'm shooting athletes playing a sport, I don't want any blur. So I need to just have that shutter open up for like a millisecond. The trade-off is that the quicker I open and close the shutter, the less light gets in. For underwater applications, this is really important because light is attenuating in the water. So I can balance the shutter with the aperture. The aperture has to do with how big the opening is that I'm opening and closing with the shutter, right? And there's a little bit of a counterintuitive nature to this, that a low f-stop, like you see up on the top of the triangle, that low f value means the focal eye of your camera opens larger. But when you do that, you introduce more depth of field, which creates that focus and blur contrast I talked about. Now, we don't want that for 3D modeling. We want crisp. So we want a really small opening, which is a high f-stop, which is down at the bottom right. But this also lets less light in. So the paradigm is that the two best things for clarity and focus is fast shutter and a small aperture, which both minimize light. So you kind of have to find a happy medium. And what can mitigate that is sensitivity, which is ISO. And so this is why like mirrorless cameras have become really popular, because their ISO ranges are far greater than what we had with conventional full frame sensor cameras. So just as an example, that's why we use Sony's now, because they adapt so well automatically to the changing light environment that I can have a better opportunity to use the settings that I want. And I don't know if any of that is making sense. Hopefully it is a little bit. If not, though, hit me up anytime. I'm happy to go into more detail. I will share like my thresholds. I try not to go below 250 for shutter and f8 for aperture. And people think like, oh, well, shutter, like you're not shooting a moving scene, but you are, because you're moving. Remember that it's structure from motion. So if I'm swimming over a reef, it makes no difference to the camera whether the reef is moving or I am moving. There is movement that I am introducing to the image. So I need the shutter to mitigate that. The next thing I'll say is be very careful with capture rate. So a lot of folks want automatic settings. So they'll use an intervalometer and make the camera take a picture every second. Yes, that's nice. So you don't have to manually click the trigger or do anything, but it also eliminates the ability of the camera to do what it is designed to do, which is adapt its autofocus and auto ISO to changes in the environment. So if I shoot too fast and the light is changing, which is happening every second of the day, I am not allowing this sophisticated technology to do its job. It will not be able to autofocus and it will not be able to adjust ISO. So a lot of groups I work with get these frustrating like strings of images that are way too dark or way too light. And I just have to keep reminding them it's because you're relying on this intervalometer. Slow down. Like you don't need to take too many images. And this always kind of shocks me because let's just take a 5x5 meter plot. I will very rarely take more than 100 to 200 images to capture that. And folks using intervalometers will get hundreds to thousands. And so it's an issue of quality over quantity. If you have too many images It bogs down the rendering time. You're introducing more images of low quality. You get a less desirable output. So there is definitely a trade-off between ease of collection and quality of data. So I'm still like obsessed with manually collecting my images because I can feel it. It's like an intuition, and I like slowing down and speeding up based on my conditions. To the level that sometimes I'm in a high current environment, and if I start getting pushed and I can't control my speed, then I'm just holding down the trigger and I'm just like bop, 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 because I don't want to lose the overlap, right? But once I stabilize, I can stop and I don't get like a glut of images that aren't going to help. Again, there's no right setting. Like I adjust every time I go down. It kind of drives my collaborators crazy because they're like, well, what setting are you going to use? And I'm like, I have no idea. I'm going to figure it out when I get down there. But I think that is key because, like any instrument, that's what we do. Like it's crazy to me because I've done a lot of molecular science, and it's like you can be running a mass spectrometer. You do the same thing. You're tweaking and adjusting the instrument for every sample. You never hit auto go. So I don't see why we would want that with a camera. If we treat it like a scientific instrument, you should optimize it every single time. A lot of people ask me about artificial lighting. It can be very helpful. I use it for like deep dives on shipwrecks. For instance, like in Guam, we've worked in Opera Harbor. It is a disgusting, high turbid, dirty environment. So sometimes I have to introduce light. If you do that, just be very careful because if you create shadows, again, you're making problems for yourself, right? Because dark areas, there's no pixel variation to match those pictures. So it can cause a lot of issues and make like black holes. I will share, use servo focus. If you are picking autofocus settings, this is designed for moving objects. It works really, really well. But the best advice I can have is just know your camera, like have fun with it. Go out and start shooting, become a better photographer. You will become a better scientist if you're doing photogrammetry because of that. A few notes on storing your imagery. A lot of our agency collaborators, they really like storing things as JPEGs because it's smaller files. The problem with that is that JPEGs are compressed. So you are losing pixel quality. And if you want to edit them later to deal with like shadows and low light issues, you will lose even more pixel information. So shoot in RAW. I can't stress that enough because RAW is uncompressed and you can edit it to your heart's content and still have the exact same resolution. This used to be a problem because you had to transfer so much data for every picture you took. And when you're taking hundreds to thousands of overlapping images, that will lag the camera. So you can like overload the memory card. But like all technology, these cards, this isn't even the fastest now, but you can get like 300 megabyte a second data transfer now. So it's not an issue. And I've had the same thing with data storage. Everyone's always like, oh, you're never going to be able to store all that data. And like, yes, I have terabytes and terabytes of the same images, but like every time I think I'm going to run out, the next generation of hard drives comes out. They have 2 to 3 times the amount of capacity for half the cost. And so I'm just riding the wave of data storage technology, and it's yet to collapse on me yet. You can get really nice like Synology storage devices. They're kind of like easy to use little data storage servers. You can RAID array your data storage and just plug and play drives as you go. And, I've got several in the lab right here with me, and, we've got hundreds and hundreds of terabytes, and it's not a massive cost barrier. I'll share a sort of funny story. Amazon created Amazon Drive several years ago, and I immediately bought it because it was like $40 a year, and photos and video were unlimited. And so I was like, this is an unbelievable loophole for me. And so I have like, like I don't know how many tens of terabytes of reef imagery that all cost me next to nothing to store. And I always just sort of laugh where like someone's had to have audited my account at some point and been like, why the hell does this person have like hundreds of thousands of pictures that just look almost identical of like the reef from like all these sequential photos? But there's also cool cloud storage options like that as well. So in a nutshell, just definitely use RAW if you can. It is a much superior aspect or format. A few things I just want to mention. that are like these unsung heroes, I call them. It's just little things to be mindful of. Auto ISO is one of the best things that's come along. You know, when I was originally toying with this over a decade ago, like there was no auto ISO on cameras, so you had to stop and adjust it every time cloud cover would change. It was a giant pain. The auto ISO, like on the Sonys now, is just so outrageously spectacular, but you have to let it work. So again, like if you're taking images too fast, you're just denying yourself access to this exceptional tool that these cameras have. For some reason, there was this huge like argument in the among like marine scientists using photogrammetry of whether to gray balance or white balance. It made no sense to me because if you ask a photographer, it doesn't matter. And it's true. You can black balance if you want to. If you're curious, like the reason why gray balance is helpful is that if you're so, you know, desiring to do so, there's a histogram function on the back of any digital camera, and it's to look at your exposure. And exposure varies from stark white, overexposed, to stark black, completely underexposed. Gray is just in the middle. And so you're trying to produce a histogram with like a normal distribution that's in the middle between white and black, because then you are not overexposed or underexposed. So the only real drawback to white balancing or black balancing is that you will see only half of the histogram, right? As opposed to gray, I'll see the full histogram. That's it. So it was really weird because I was at HIMB for this workshop and there was literally arguments that broke out about how like you have to gray balance or white balance. And then I just asked everyone like, have you ever looked at the histogram? And it was humorous to me, like no one even knew how to pull the histogram up on the back of the camera. And so I was like, you know, like this doesn't even matter. You're like arguing over nothing. It's really only if you want to see the full histogram. So don't stress over that. The point is just do whatever's easiest. So for us, we use white slates for gathering data. So it is a very useful kill two birds with one stone device. Use it for your white balance, go about your way, right? And if you shoot in RAW, you can always correct it later. So like I have color calibration stickers and I photograph those on the slate when I white balance so I can go back in and color correct later. I will say though, it is critical to white balance because if you don't, you'll get those ugly like blue washed underwater images and then you lose all the vibrance color, which is actually really helpful for analyzing these habitats. You also just want to be mindful, like the capacity to pick up light is very sensor dependent. So this is again why, like if you know you're working in Kaneohe Bay, for instance, I always use my most sensitive cameras when I go there because it's very, very murky. So like knowing that about your environment will kind of dictate which tools are most helpful for you. Another critical thing to be mindful of is like the models you just made for Luma AI. There's no reference scale, right? So if you want to actually measure things, you have to have scale bars to calibrate everything and put it into a proper spatial framework. Um, we use like these coded targets that you can print and they work like barcodes and then you can auto detect them in the models, tell it the distances between these targets, and it'll now put everything into like proper spatial resolution. And now you can make measurements and know exactly like how far it is between points, what the true contour path is between 2 points. And this is how we derive things like ruggedness, slope, curvature, all these useful values that explain the nuances of like coral colony morphology, right? So just know that you got to have scale bars. The more the merrier, and the longer they are, the better accuracy you get because people forget this a lot. Like even a ruler you buy, it'll have a little bit of error, right? And so if a 50 centimeter ruler has like a fraction of a millimeter of error, that magnifies across the distance of your plot, right? So you want essentially like highly accurate scale bars, and the longer the better. So if you're doing really big areas, like when we map coastlines with drones, we use like really huge targets because we want high spatial accuracy. If it's a small area, you can get away with smaller ones. So, it's just important to consider. And then you want to make sure you have some juxtaposition, meaning that like allow your scale bars to be sort of in different positions because that's what helps calibrate the Z axis, right? Like vertical relief. If they're all the same, like flat oriented the same way, you're not making it have to understand how the elevation is changing. So it's very much okay, if not better, for them to be placed kind of wildly around. Like you don't need them flat, is what I'm trying to say. Like you know the distance between the start and end of it. So the more kind of variation they have, the better. And then this little GIF is just showing kind of how our flight paths work underwater. You're following like a lawnmower pattern because you want about 70 to 80% overlap in all your images for that SIFT algorithm to work, like I talked about, right? And that's why video is the format that Luma AI uses. It doesn't want to worry about people not getting enough image overlap. So if you use video, it'll split the video into stills automatically to make sure there's enough overlap among each still frame pixel image it pulls from it. And so main thing to know there is just like get a sense of how much area you have in your field of view, and that should dictate the timing of your image speed, right? How fast you're taking photos. So if I have a lot of area in my image, I can wait longer between taking the images because there'll still be a lot of overlap. Whereas if you're very close to what you're 3D modeling, you're going to need more images taken faster to retain that high overlap. And you want the overlap. This is really important in both the forward back direction and side to side. So this is why like your lawnmower pattern needs to ensure that you've got overlap in both directions. And field of views in your cameras are rectangular. So you have a little bit more buffer side to side than you do moving forward. So you've got to be thinking of two things, like the speed at which you take your images to have overlap in your forward motion, and then how close your flight paths are to have overlap on the sides. And as long as you have enough, you'll be able to align all the images and build a 3D model. If you're doing this underwater, navigation is key. So learn how to use your compass and get really good at dead reckoning. The biggest thing I think that helps is not staring at the camera the whole time. You have to get comfortable trusting it and, you know, like look at an object a few meters away in the direction you're going and just focus on swimming there. And dead reckoning is doing that. You pick objects in the line path that you're trying to go and you sort of move object to object while still looking up so that you're aware of your surroundings. That tends to give you the smoothest flight paths. Practice makes perfect. And like I said, don't get nervous and take too many pictures. You can definitely have, you know, a problem of excess. It's all about quality over quantity. I can't stress enough, again, your question should dictate exactly how you set up everything we are saying. And then, you know, build your setup that is not just useful for your scientific approach, but also what's reasonable. So, you know, we're all at different stages. We all have different budgets. You know, I'll never forget that first Canon 5D I bought. I felt like I had just like cheated the system because I'd wanted that camera for so long, you know, and was so excited to use it. But I still have that camera and we still use it on research projects today, right? Like that's sort of the value of investing in a little bit higher quality system. And then housings play a big role too. So, you know, Ike Light housings, they're the clear acrylic ones. They're much cheaper. They work great, but they have spring-loaded buttons, which tend to fail over time. So when we do deeper projects, we have to use like Nauticam housings because it's mechanical buttons. They don't have that same problem. So, you know, we do stuff like with rebreather divers. And so you just have to be aware of like the depths you're going and what systems will work. And that's why like my last statement here is just it really should be an adaptive tool, not a prescriptive tool. Like you want to always be willing to change your approach. When it comes to model building techniques, it's why I always start with the photos, because the better image quality and the more overlap you have, the easier this step is. It can almost be plug and play if your pictures are good. The only time I get stuck spending weeks like troubleshooting The process is when the images have issues, and then you've got to really tweak the parameters of the algorithms to get it to work. And that's just honestly a pain because it takes my time, and I want to be doing other things. So like why I spend so much time doing these silly things like calculating optimal flight paths and distance from the scene is because I want to make sure when I get back to the lab, I can relax and just run everything through our pipeline. And so we use Agisoft software. It's Metashape. It's not the best. I'll be honest, like Pix4D is probably a little bit more robust, but the licenses are like $10,000 a pop, whereas educational licenses for Agisoft are only $550. So considering we've got, like 20 students in the lab, for me, Metashape is a better approach. It is always evolving. And so sometimes you can get better results by simply updating to the latest software version, because they are refining, excuse me, the algorithms constantly. And so you don't want to pay for something and have an outdated version that's not as fast and not as high quality for your end data products. And this little graphical thing is basically showing you like you're taking all your images, you're aligning them together, and you'll produce these 3D models. From the 3D models, you can generate two things. On the left side here on the top, you get like a mosaic image, right? So this is all the images aligned and matched. And now it's kind of like that pano scene I was talking about, with the old film days where you line them all up and you see everything. So that's really critical because if your image quality is good, you can zoom in and trace coral recruits that are like, millimeters in size because there's enough detail to see them. And then underneath that, you have a digital elevation model. Oh, awesome. Okay, sorry, I just saw the chat. You guys are using Metashape. Hell yeah. Yeah, you're learning it. You know what's up. And then under that, you have a digital elevation model. And so this is just a raster file. And thus, every pixel cell that's matched to the image, the mosaic image, has elevational data. And so then from that, right, we can like digitize and then extract three-dimensional data from any object. So this is how you can like trace a coral colony or a tree or a rock or anything and then extract its three-dimensional structural properties. The whole process starts by making like a point cloud, like you were seeing in Luma AI, and then you can connect all those points to build a mesh. You don't have to do this, but it's really useful for viewing the models. And it's also helpful for like doing change detection through time, as well as like 3D printing. So there's some fun things you can do with this. Like you can 3D print the 3D models. You can build physical things. From an analytical standpoint, I do like to stress that when you create the mosaics and the DEMs, you can only do it from one projection angle at a time. So you have to make a pretty critical decision, which is what angle do I want to view and analyze this scene? So I'm going to use Kaneohe Bay again as another just sort of case study. It is a patch reef system. So you have these kind of like vertical mounding reefs. And so if I am modeling one of those, the depth is changing, right? From like the top of that patch reef to the bottom. So I can view that two ways. I could project it from the real world orientation, right? As if I was looking top down in Google Earth. And then it'll appear shorter because there's all this slope. Or I can angle it as though I'm looking at it from the side, which would make it appear longer, but it's not having the true like real world slope, if that makes sense, right? We experiment with this and found like it doesn't really change the 3D metrics, but it can change how easy it is to see what's there and digitize it. So we tend to use the projection angle that you're photographing. So if I was doing a patch reef in K Bay, right, and it's sloped like this, my images are all facing straight into the reef. And so I will turn that and then project my mosaic and DEM downward. And the reason we do this is because we found that it doesn't change the way the structural parameters are computed, And I don't think fish care about gravity and top world views like we do, right? Like it is irrelevant to them. They're just looking for nooks and crannies to hide in. But regardless, you always have to choose that when you analyze structure with geospatial tools. So make sure you have a rhyme and a reason, because people might question you about it, and you want to be able to justify why you chose what you chose. You will need the scale bars to, like I mentioned, like spatially rectify everything. And then another huge area of consideration is this third bullet. You set the resolution of those DEM cells. So by default, they will be as small as your pixels. So if you have a really high resolution model, the raster cells, which are squares, right? All pixels are squares, might be sub-millimeter. That's great. But the problem with that is if I'm trying to measure structural features, fish probably aren't responding to like 0.5 millimeter changes in physical habitat, if that makes sense. And the way 3D metrics are computed, it's in 3x3 cell windows. So we've found that like the lowest you really want to go is about 1 centimeter for those cells. So that then I'm computing spatial properties in 3x3 centimeter cell windows. And we found that that very consistently captures features, meaning mounding corals will have structural signatures that are consistent with one another versus like branching corals. So to simplify all of that, if your resolution is too fine scale, you can't see those signatures. Likewise, if it's too coarse, you're not capturing things at a small scale, right? It's not about corals now. It's about like the overall shape of the patch reef, if you will. Or if I use a spur and groove environment, like I can capture big spurs and grooves at a coarser resolution, and I might want to capture colony dynamics at a finer resolution. So we've experimented with those a lot, and we use multiple resolutions in the same projects, depending on if I'm interested in like general reefscape features versus like fine scale coral features. So you just don't want to get trapped in like, oh, well, I read this study and they used this resolution. You want to make sure it's going to capture the features that you're looking at. And then Kylie had a question like in that vertical environment, what's the method for placing scale bars? So again, like it doesn't really matter their orientation. You just want some juxtaposition, right? So I might have some scale bars like just on top of the corals sort of vertically along the wall of the patch reef. And then I might try get some that are like maybe going into a hole so that they're not all oriented the same. And then always have at least four, right? So you want them sort of at the edges of your plot because the edges of your plot will have the most distortion. So just another practical tip, like if I'm doing a 5x5 meter area, that's my study plot, I'm actually going to map probably 8x8 meters so that I crop out the 5x5 so that my study area is away from the distorted edges. And so around the 5x5, ideally I have like 6 scale bars, 4 at the corners and maybe 2 along the sides, because that's going to give me better accuracy. And also like I want them on the edges where it's most prone to distortion. Last tip I'll have for you is like you end up with so many files, right? Like thousands of images, multiple model products, and then multiple data files. So from a data science perspective, it is like a great example of be diligent and systematic with your file naming. There's nothing more irritating than like misnaming a file and you can't go back and locate the original images. So I always name it by like site, date, as many identifiers as possible. And I add the initials of the photographer. So like I know who did the survey if we run into some weird issues later. One of the best tips I can give is before I start a survey, I write down all the metadata on like a data sheet, and that is the first photograph I take. Then I take all the pictures of the scene, and then I'll like photograph my hand for the end. That way, like I know even if I lose those data sheets or whatever happens, like at the start of all the images is a data sheet with who's taking the images, what the site name is, what time it was, a little diagram of where they place the scale bars, everything, and we note things like what bearing were we headed when we started? Where was like the GPS? Was it the bottom left of the plot? Is it the middle of the plot, right? Like anything that is relevant, put it in there because it will be useful later. And then this leads kind of towards the back end, which is data analysis. There's so many tools you can do with this. From a data science side, like we use a lot of things in ArcGIS, like ArcMap, because it's a software designed for analyzing terrain, right? So with analyzing rasters, it is built for that. But I won't lie, I hate that program. It is so buggy and so frustrating to use. So it took us several years, but we reverse engineered all of their terrain metrics. So that was really hard because if you just look at these graphs I have on the right, focus on the box that if you can see my mouse kind of hovering around, imagine that's a raster cell. So say I'm digitizing a coral and my polygon goes through a raster cell. ArcMap will not tell you how they deal with that, right? Like, do they use the proportion of the cell that is in my polygon? Do they remove it if it's not fully in the polygon? Do they take half of it? Like, there's no way to know. So we just tried every single thing imaginable until our equations got the exact same results that theirs did. The reason why we battled through this for years is now we have everything in R scripts. And I will happily share those with anyone that's interested. They're linked to most of our publications in the supplementary files. And the reason we do that is because it can take like weeks to do some of these things in like ArcMap because of the processing time. And, as you know, with R, everything is faster in a coding environment because you're not dealing with the user interface and the graphics. So we actually now process most of our DEMs with spatial packages in R. And so it just makes it all automated. So stuff that would take us weeks, we can do in like 45 seconds. And this all goes back to file naming, believe it or not, because if your file naming is consistent, you can write a function to say, go to this folder, take everything with this root file name. And that way, like every image or folder, right, that like shares the first properties of that file name will get used. We automate the cropping of the DEM and then the extraction of every single 3D metric at every single resolution we're interested in. And it just happens in seconds. So I kind of encourage all of you, because this is a data science seminar, to like try move into that space. Whether it's R or Python, you can get a lot done with these new geospatial packages. Yeah, we do have a GitHub. It's under Atsuko's. So Atsuko Fukunaga is a really close collaborator, and her GitHub has all these scripts for the different geospatial equations. And then just to share some of our outputs, like we're really interested, as I mentioned, like how habitat drives reef organisms. Same way we could look at like a forest and how the tree canopy influences like birds or insects or whatever. And so once you compute all these things, you can use multivariate ordinations. And so like on the bottom left, you're seeing a distance-based redundancy analysis. And every little centroid is a site collected from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And in the blue circle, you're seeing how the ordination space is diversified based on structural characteristics that drove differences in the sites. So sites to the top right have really high ruggedness, meaning there's a lot of like surface complexity derived by corals. Therefore, like sites to the bottom left have less complexity. Sites to the bottom right have more depth. Sites towards the top have higher levels of curvature. And then the colored pie slices are the dominant fish species seen at all of those sites. And so you start to notice these patterns of fish groups that are associated with various types of habitat. And then that's what helps us do the models you see on the right, where we can like predict the abundance of different groups like corallivores, which feed on corals, or herbivores, which feed on algae. And we've figured out like specific 3D metrics as well as the resolutions at which you want to quantify them. And this has been a huge advancement, in the field, because now we can tell you like what type of habitat complexity is most important for different fish groups. And a paper we're doing right now, led by Sophie, who's actually been involved in data science since she was an undergrad. Now she's doing her master's. She's been doing this here for the Park Service at Koloko Honokohau, and she's actually doing it in a trait-based framework. So we're seeing like which coral traits drive different functional groups of fish. And it's really cool to see these patterns emerge that make a lot of sense, right? That like certain types of morphology and coral traits will drive certain functional groups of fish. And I get super excited by this because it helps to unlock the mysteries of what makes an ecosystem function. And one crazy thing we keep seeing is that you can have all the complexity in the world, but if it's not derived by living coral, it does not produce the same positive response in fish. And so it's kind of alarming to me because we have a lot of ego in the human race, and we just keep thinking like, oh, we'll re-engineer these systems and we'll make artificial reefs. And like, you can make all the artificial structure you want. It just does not have the same magic of living coral. And so it's kind of exciting to quantitatively show that, because now we have like the ammunition we need to advocate for protecting healthy corals, because not only do they produce the structure, but there is something about structure derived from living coral that supports a lot more fish and diverse organisms than just the structure alone. I just have a few notes in here that I was already saying, like ArcMap is great, but if you've ever used it, you know why I have my issues with it. QGIS is free and really helpful and does a lot of the same things. And for those of you that are doing this, you're probably aware that like tracing features sucks and takes forever. And so you can also use point-based annotation tools and couple that with machine learning to very rapidly like extract, metrics like coral cover and coral diversity. And even more exciting are tools like TagLab and RoboFlow, where you can like we're getting really high success with those. You can machine learn, train the machine learning models to automatically detect corals. They're not really great with labeling species because corals are irritating, and like the same species will look really different at different locations and different depths and so forth. But at least the tracing is done for you, and all you got to do is fix labels. So again, a really great area where data science has rapidly improved the efficiency of this. So I strongly recommend, relying on that. And then I do just want to say, you got to remember that like when we're using DEMs, it really is 2.5D, right? Because we're picking that single projection angle. So we've been experimenting with analyzing 3D metrics from the actual mesh models, but it's a bit of a Pandora's box because the resolution of the mesh alters your results, and you can't have the same standardized framework that you can with a raster. And so what I mean by that is I can say, hey, you set your raster to 1 centimeter cells. I'll set my raster to 1 centimeter cells. Now you and I can compare our results. We've standardized the framework. With meshes, it's very hard to do that, because if you use a different camera than me, even if we set all the same parameters in Metashape, we'll get two different quality meshes, and that quality alters the results of these structural metrics if you analyze the actual 3D model. So I don't know if we'll ever really move away from DEM. So it is important to kind of understand like how DEMs work for analyses and how the cell size sort of changes the results that you're going to get. And then this is just examples of like one of our publications where, as I mentioned before, you can kind of find the Goldilocks sweet spot for resolutions that will identify signatures from specific Hawaiian corals. So if you're consistent with this and you do it enough, you can get to a point where it's not a guessing game. You can figure out like the best resolution to use depending on the species of interest that you have. And this translates to any environment. Could be terrestrial, could be geology with rocks. Like, it's good to do the dirty work to figure out like what captures the features that you're interested in studying. And then just to kind of show you how some of these look, this is a fun project we've been doing with reef footwear, actually. So Cliff Capono, who's in the lab I mentioned before, he's a pro surfer. He rides for Reef. They're really big into supporting science and conservation. So we set out and we've been mapping surf breaks all around Hawaii and the Pacific. And so, like, this is Pipeline on the north shore of Oahu. And it's, kind of cool. Just pay attention to the features, right? Because this is like geologically super interesting. This is like a really old reef. And you get these kind of valleys and holes, very distinct holes that are perfectly located where like the best barrel sections are of these waves. Whereas this is Cloudbreak in Fiji. It's like a very long barrel and it's very different. It's much more of like veins of spur and groove and shockingly high coral cover in an area that has outrageous water flow and high wave energy disturbance. And so it's actually been like super fascinating to me because no one's surveyed reef breaks because it's difficult to do so. And we realized like this is a huge missed opportunity for science because just realizing that corals can live in these high wave energy environments kind of flips the script on what we thought about water motion and coral survival. And on top of that, we've been using like GPS tracks from where the surfers go and where the best parts of the wave are. And now we're dissecting the actual like geomorphological features that produce a pull of water through that reef that actually kind of extends the shape of the barrel. So we're stumbling into this like wave science area that is totally new and beneficial for us. There's a massive global community that's interested in it. So it's just one of those examples where you can conduct science that has a really high public interest and it helps engage people that may not have seen the value of this tool. But when it relates to something they care about, they do. And so one anecdotal story I'll share is, I went to college in California. I surfed with a bunch of guys from Santa Cruz, and there's like this group of older professional surfers that are now fishermen, and they're like super anti-science. And the reason is like they love to bottom fish, and NOAA Fisheries like shuts down rock fishing species, and they like hate that. So they're like really, really like, oh, scientists are the worst. And then we played these videos, and Cliff was one of the announcers for the pipeline contest last year. And all these surfers saw it and started talking about it. And so my friend from Santa Cruz who lives on the west side, he's like, oh, dude, you wouldn't believe it. Like, their names are hilarious, but like he's like, oh yeah, Rat Boy and Flea, they're all at the point and they're all talking about the pipeline reef model and they want to get steamer lane mapped because they're all worried about the coastal erosion and how it's going to impact the wave quality. And like that is exactly what we're going for, is getting these people that thought they hated science to now be talking about how science can help them understand this coastal area that they care about. So I just want to share that to kind of go back to the beginning of mentioning like it doesn't hurt sometimes to tweak your scientific questions to make sure that the value of the results has meaning to people from these areas that we're studying. And this is just one success story that we've had. And another great example to show, if you look at the picture you're seeing on the screen, this was a massive, massive area. It's like several football fields long. And I couldn't dive it because it's so shallow. And so this was an example where like I had to totally tweak the lenses and the system I was using for that specific place to make this work, right? So it might be intimidating to work in deep environments, or murky Kaneohe or whatever it is. But that's the most fun part of science is troubleshooting. Like there's always a way to make it work. You just got to be willing to fail. And I love failing, because failing is what makes you better at what you do. So don't get dismayed, fail away and you will learn and get better and better at what you do. I think science is funny that we're such perfectionists, but like at the end of the day, we're actually perfect failures because we're always trying to get better and better at it. So no matter where you are in your career, just embrace that process. And just to share one more story from this, we went to Teopo'o last year to map that wave because it's a very famous wave. It's where the Olympics were held this year. And the community, the lady in green there is Cindy Punahele, and she is like Um, she is like the community leader down there, and they were kind of devastated because the International Olympic Committee came in and was like, "Oh yeah, we're going to do the Olympics here, so we're putting in a new judging tower because the judges want air conditioning, toilets. They don't want to get their feet dirty walking on the beach. So we're going to pave a pathway over your pristine beach. We're going to dredge out to the reef to build a new tower and rip out the whole existing, area that you had." And we showed up. They had a bunch of questions for us. And, we told them what we do, and we offered our services. We offered to train them. And it was really touching because they kind of went and hooeyed up, and then they came back and they're like, all right, we're interested, but what's the cost? How much is this going to cost us? And we're like, no, 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 no. This is free. Like we'll even give you camera equipment, So we got Sony to donate some cameras and GoPro, and we got them like maybe $40,000 in camera equipment. And in 3 days, we trained them. They collected all the imagery that built 3D models in the whole dredging path and the whole existing. There's an old dredging tower they have there. So we mapped everything. And then we got like about 10 undergrad and graduate students here at Hilo and Manoa, and we just dropped everything else and in about a month analyzed all the 3D models to figure out like how many species of corals were there, what area, like how much area was occupied by corals. And then we used the Hawaii State penalty matrix. Like if you drop anchor on a reef, right, it's illegal, or if a ship grounds, and there's a fee for each different type of species for how much area. And we computed it was like going to be over $1 million in damage. And I was both just so impressed at how well these folks like learned the methods because they had the passion to do so. Like we were able to include some of them as co-authors. But it also goes to show how rigid our system is. Like they didn't want to let them be co-authors because they didn't have academic institution emails. Luckily, I'm an editor at Remote Sensing, so I had to fight that because I think that's absolute exclusion and just outrageous. And then we had another weird thing where they ended up giving us 5 reviewers. 4 of them loved the work, and then the press came out that we had done this, and then they added a 5th reviewer at the last second that was like way off base, and we had the manuscript accepted pending minor revisions, and they tried to reverse the decision to reject. And I think they were scared to be like associated with this thing coming out against the Olympic Committee is my best guess. And so again, thank goodness I was an editor. I just cried foul and threatened to quit and like publish the whole process that happened. So they brought in 4 more academic editors to review the whole series of revisions and responses, and thankfully decided it should get published. But all of that is just to say, the power of this tool to me now is the technology has become so user friendly that this is something we should be adopting for more citizen science initiatives. And to come full circle, this is why we're trying to do that map to adapt program, because we realize like there could be communities all over the world that don't have the resources that we're fortunate enough to have. And we've got to find better ways to put these scientific tools in their hands so that they can also be able to protect and preserve their ecosystems, because environmental degradation is a global issue, and it shouldn't only have solutions in first world places. We've got to do a better job with that. So that's kind of it for most of the technical stuff. I'm sorry if I bored everybody with like a ton of details, but it is a workshop, so I wanted to try and make sure there was something in there useful. But I can't stress enough, like the best thing to do is just go out and try it. Like a lot of people accuse me of like withholding like secrets that I have that make my models good and like how we get some of these data outputs that we do. But it's just like, honestly, it's a Malcolm Gladwell thing. He has that theory of 1,000 hours, right? If you do 1,000 hours of something, like that's how you get to being an expert. And it's like, I've been battling this stuff for a decade. I've run into like every problem there is. So it's no mystery. It's just the intuition comes from the process of trying so many times. So, go easy on yourself. Don't expect perfection the first time, but the more you play around with it and the more you do fail, every one of those experiences gives you very valuable knowledge. So, like, the best thing to do is just mess around, try different things, and you are on your path to being an expert too. It's easier now than it used to be, but there is no substitution for the experiential time. You just got to put in the hours. The last thing I want to share that's like a little interactive is we have like an outreach exhibit space we made, and we wanted to get kids fired up on this stuff. So we actually have um, an augmented reality app. So if you have an iPhone, you can go to like, it's just Mega Lab AR for augmented reality. You can download the app, and this video is just showing you the interface. We honestly stole the idea from Pokemon Go because I thought it was so hilarious how obsessed people got, and they were like walking into city streets and stuff, chasing these little characters. So we made our own targets. And when you hold the targets into your phone viewer, the 3D models will pop up. And so you can like explore them and see all these different reefs that we've collected from around the world. And it was like the easiest way that we found to, you know, get these data products out of like a scientific vault. So when you open the app, there's also like a little button to print targets, and you can print them yourself. Feel free to use it for anything. Like we love it for outreach here. And if any of you want to use it for anything anywhere, like please do. You know, it's there to be played with and have fun. And also, if you want to build your own, this is not very hard to do with Unity. So if you are doing 3D modeling, some of you mentioned in the chat, you're in like 3D modeling classes, like just, there's Unity tutorials online. They're easy to follow. It's just basic augmented reality, and it's a great way to like bring your research to life in a very easy way. Just last night, we had the Hawaii Environmental Funders Group down at our exhibit space at Mokuba Papa. And these are like adults that are CEOs of these like foundations in Hawaii, and they saw a branching coral pop up and like lost their minds, you know? So it reminded me of like, there's a kid in all of us, you know, and sometimes this stuff is just fun. And we even realized too, like we went beyond the 3D models. So even like the photos in our outreach exhibit, like all of it, the signs, we made targets out of everything. So like we made a documentary for the project in Fiji, and if you hold your phone over the pictures that are up in that exhibit, it just starts playing clips from the videos. So there's all kinds of ways to do this. I've got a few of the targets. Let's see if I can get the next slide to come up here in a second. But yeah, if you want to download the app, these are what the targets look like. You know, you can, even on the screen, it'll work. If you have it on your phone, you can just hold it over them and you'll see the 3D models pop up. But let's see, I think that's, yeah, the last slide I have. So I'll leave these up for a second if you want to do it, but I'm really curious, did anyone's Luma models finish processing? Oh, still queued. Bummer. All right. And a few of you are still queued. Can anyone like just unmute and be like, yeah, mine worked? Oh, maybe we're like flooding them right now. All right, that's cool. Let it run. You'll be able to check them out later. Hopefully they work out. But I did want to leave some time for questions. I'll leave these targets up. So if you're downloading the app, you can check it out and see how they look. But does anyone have any specific questions or comments or thoughts, feelings, concerns, anything you're interested in?
I'm so sorry. I was trying to find the GitHub, and I was struggling to find like the right GitHub. Would you mind putting it in the chat?
Yeah, let me it's just a little tricky with the screen share. Do you mind emailing me and then I can give you the link? It's just my email. I'll put it in the chat right now, and anyone is welcome to reach out anytime. It's just johnhr@hawaii.edu. But if you shoot me an email, yeah, I can send you a link to the GitHub. And Josh Maiden also just released, he has a GitHub too. They just released a package called Hab Tools. It's like Habitat Tools. And he's a really awesome scientist at HIMB. You might work with him already, but yeah, we like cross-calibrated a lot of them too. So his is another great resource as well. And again, they're all based in R. So definitely check out those ones as well. They work really good.
Thank you.
I have a question.
All right.
Do you like pre-process your images and get rid of all the fish first for aligning all the photos and yeah.
Yeah, so that's the nice thing with the way the scale and variant feature transform works. Anything moving will get automatically removed. So it's not a big deal if fish swim through. I've even had divers accidentally swim underneath me, and you don't have to stress out too much. All of that will get, won't get rendered into your model. When I do pre-process images, like if I had a little bit of like underexposure or overexposure, my favorite tool, if you're curious, is just Adobe Lightroom, because I'll take the raw images and then I can like batch process strings that were, say, underexposed, right? Because it might only be 30 images out of a 300 image sequence that were a little too dark or a little too light. And then you can just adjust how you want to, like, maybe increase exposure in the shadows, maybe add a little bit of sharpness to them, maybe de-blur, whatever it might be. And you can just apply it to all the images at once. And I didn't mention this before, it's in the slides, but then I tend to export as TIFFs. I think that you get the best model results with TIFF. But full disclosure, I always shoot in JPEG and RAW. And if I'm really happy with the images, I'll just run a model off the JPEGs right away just to see how it looks. And sometimes that's good enough. And you can work with that, but I always save the raw files because it's the only ones that I can go back and tweak stuff later if I have to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions?
John, just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing. This was a really great learning experience. And can see how passionate you are about this. Liked all the examples. And I really like the part about feeling. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, no worries. Just being the professor I am, I'm gonna pick on who is the person that's in Geo 370 right now that's doing photogrammetry?
Me, but I'm in the library, so I can't really speak very loudly.
Oh no, I gotta like put you on the spot. But yeah, if you don't mind though, like it's really cool that they're doing that as a class. Where are they having you analyze like the DEMs in a geospatial software?
No, it's really just been like we did a 3D, the creation of a 3D model using my phone in Metashape. Everything else has just been basically analyzing and reanalyzing in ArcGIS Pro, like 2 photos that they gave us. So this was a lot more technical, a lot more, actual kind of data science piece to it. And yeah, went a lot deeper than what we've covered in Geo 370 thus far.
Okay, cool. So yeah, now I'm like whispering to, like, I feel like I'm in the library. I'm like, okay, cool, right on, that's great. We do share all of our protocols too. We're really open with it. So if you're enjoying that class and you want to try some of the things I talked about, and this applies to anyone, email me anytime and I'll share all those protocols from the ArcMap ones to the R scripts and so forth. So if any of you are just like, oh, I want to kind of try this and see how it works, I figure like let's all, rise up together and benefit from what's been done. So I'm super happy to share all of that if anybody wants to like just kind of jumpstart and go for it as well. So yeah, the emails in the chat, just hit me up. But Yeah, I don't know if there's no more questions. Shivani, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Again, thank you so much, John, for your time and going through all of the technical information that was really useful. And thanks everyone for joining us for our workshop. Wish you all a happy and safe Friday.
Yeah, have a great weekend, everyone.
Oh, I will put a survey link in the chat. If you would complete that to give us feedback on the survey, that will be very much appreciated. Thank you all.
Thanks, Shivani.